On a rainy Thursday afternoon in October 1987, Sandra Williams was doing what thousands of McDonald's employees across America do every single day. She was cleaning up after the lunch rush, wiping down tables, emptying trash bins, and restocking napkin dispensers at the McDonald's on Route 50 in Fairfax, Virginia. But what she discovered that day would expose one of the most elaborate Soviet intelligence operations ever uncovered on American soil. Sandra had been working at this particular McDonald's for just over 8 months. She was 19 years old, a community college student who worked part-time to help pay for her textbooks and gas money. Her shift that day was supposed to end at 3 p.m., but her manager had asked her to stay late because another employee had called in sick. So there she was, working through the dining area methodically, when she noticed something unusual about one of the Happy Meal boxes left behind on a corner table. The box itself looked normal from a distance. Red and yellow McDonald's branding, cartoon characters smiling from the sides, the typical promotional imagery you'd expect from a children's meal container. But as Sandra got closer to clear the table, she noticed something that made her pause. The bottom of the box had been carefully opened and then resealed with what appeared to be clear tape. Not the kind of damage you'd see from a child eagerly tearing into their meal, but something more deliberate, more precise. Her first thought was that maybe a parent had helped their child open the box and then tried to close it back up to keep the toy inside from falling out. It wasn't uncommon for parents to do things like that, especially when they were eating in the restaurant and wanted to keep small pieces contained. But when Sandra picked up the box to throw it away, she immediately knew something was different. The box was heavier than it should have been, much heavier. A standard Happy Meal box, even with leftover food inside, had a certain weight to it that Sandra had become familiar with after months of cleaning up after families. This box felt like it had rocks inside it. She shook it gently, and instead of hearing the rustle of paper wrappers or the rattle of a small plastic toy, she heard something that sounded almost metallic, something dense and solid moving around inside. Sandra's curiosity got the better of her. She looked around the dining area to make sure no customers were watching, then carefully peeled back the tape that had been used to reseal the bottom of the box. What she found inside would have seemed completely ordinary to most people, but to Sandra, who had grown up with a father who worked in electronics and had spent countless hours in his workshop, it looked immediately suspicious. There were 3 small plastic toys, the kind you'd normally expect to find in a Happy Meal. But these toys had been modified. Each one had been carefully opened, and inside the hollow plastic shells, someone had placed what appeared to be tiny electronic components. Circuit boards no larger than postage stamps, miniature batteries, and what looked like small radio transmitters, all connected with hair-thin wires and secured with what appeared to be professional-grade adhesive. The toys themselves were part of a McDonald's promotional series, featuring popular cartoon characters from a children's television show that was running at the time. From the outside, they looked completely normal. A small plastic figure of a superhero, a miniature car, and a cartoon animal. But someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hollow them out and fill them with electronics while making the modifications virtually undetectable to casual observation. Sandra's father had taught her enough about electronics to recognize that this wasn't some kind of amateur radio project or a child's broken toy that had been repaired with random components. The work was too precise, too professional. The components were too sophisticated for someone to just have lying around their house. This looked like the kind of work that required specialized knowledge, expensive equipment, and access to parts that most people couldn't just walk into a store and buy. But what really concerned Sandra was the question of why someone would go to all this trouble. Why would anyone spend the time and money to modify Happy Meal toys with electronic components? Why would they then carefully reseal the box and leave it behind in a McDonald's dining area? And most importantly, what were these components designed to do? She decided to take the toys home with her after her shift ended. She wrapped them carefully in napkins and placed them in her backpack, along with the modified Happy Meal box. Her plan was to show them to her father, who she knew would be able to tell her more about what the electronic components were and what they might be used for. That evening, Sandra sat at her father's workbench while he examined the toys under a magnifying lamp, with the kind of intense focus she remembered from her childhood, when he would spend hours working on radio projects. Her father's name was Robert Williams, and he had worked for over 20 years as an electronics technician for a defense contractor in the Washington, D.C. area. He held security clearances that allowed him to work on sensitive projects, and he had extensive experience with the kind of sophisticated electronics that were used in government and military applications. After nearly an hour of careful examination, Robert looked up at his daughter with an expression she'd never seen before. It was a mixture of concern, confusion, and something that looked almost like fear. He told Sandra that the components inside the toys were not ordinary electronic parts. They were sophisticated radio transmitters, the kind used for covert communication. The circuit boards were professionally manufactured, not the kind of thing someone could assemble in their garage. The batteries were a type used in specialized government applications, and most concerning of all, the transmitters appeared to be configured to operate on frequencies that were typically reserved for intelligence agencies. Robert explained to Sandra that what she had found looked like the kind of equipment that would be used for dead drops, a method of passing information between intelligence operatives without requiring face-to-face contact. The transmitters could be programmed to broadcast coded signals at predetermined times, or they could be designed to receive and store coded messages for later retrieval. Either way, they represented a level of sophistication that suggested professional intelligence work. The implications were staggering. Someone was using McDonald's Happy Meal toys as a cover for what appeared to be espionage equipment. They were placing modified toys in Happy Meal boxes, leaving them in public restaurants, and presumably using them as part of a covert communication network. The McDonald's where Sandra worked was located in Northern Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C., an area with one of the highest concentrations of government employees, defense contractors, and intelligence personnel in the entire United States. Robert told his daughter that this was not something they could ignore or handle on their own. If his assessment was correct, if these toys were indeed being used for intelligence purposes, then they had stumbled upon something that needed to be reported to federal authorities immediately. The year was 1987, the height of the Cold War, and tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were as high as they had ever been. Any evidence of foreign intelligence operations on American soil was treated as a matter of national security. But Robert also understood that simply calling the FBI and telling them that his daughter had found some suspicious electronics in Happy Meal toys might not be taken seriously. They needed more evidence, more documentation, more proof that what they had found was part of a larger pattern rather than an isolated incident. So Robert and Sandra developed a plan that would either prove their suspicions or put their fears to rest. Sandra would continue working her regular shifts at the McDonald's, but now she would pay special attention to any Happy Meal boxes that seemed unusual or out of place. She would document everything she found, taking photographs when possible, and keeping detailed notes about when and where she discovered each item. Meanwhile, Robert would use his contacts in the defense contracting community to quietly research the components they had already found, trying to determine their origin and intended purpose without alerting anyone to what they had discovered. Over the next 3 weeks, Sandra found 4 more modified Happy Meal toys. Each discovery followed a similar pattern. The toys would be left behind in boxes that had been carefully opened and resealed, always on tables in the back corner of the dining area. Always during the afternoon hours when the restaurant was relatively quiet between the lunch and dinner rushes. The modifications were consistent across all the toys. Professional-grade electronics, sophisticated transmitters, miniature components that suggested significant expertise and resources. But Sandra also began to notice something else during those 3 weeks of careful observation. There was a pattern to when the modified toys appeared, and more importantly, there was a pattern to who was in the restaurant when they appeared. She started recognizing faces, people who would come in during the same time periods, order small items like coffee or French fries, sit in the dining area for longer than seemed normal, and then leave without finishing their food. One man in particular caught her attention. He was in his 40s, well-dressed but not in a way that drew attention, always carrying a briefcase or a newspaper, and he had a habit of sitting at different tables each time he visited. He would order a coffee, sit for about 20 minutes reading or writing in a small notebook, and then leave. Sandra noticed that on 3 separate occasions, modified Happy Meal boxes appeared in the restaurant within an hour of his visits. Another person who seemed suspicious was a woman in her 30s who would come in with what appeared to be her young son. They would order Happy Meals, sit in the dining area for a normal amount of time, and then leave. But Sandra noticed that the woman always seemed to be paying more attention to the other customers in the restaurant than to her child. And on 2 occasions, she had seen the woman quickly exchange her son's Happy Meal box with an identical box that she had brought with her in a large purse. Robert, meanwhile, had been conducting his own investigation into the electronic components. Using his security clearance and his contacts within the defense contracting community, he had been able to determine that the circuit boards were manufactured by a company that specialized in equipment for intelligence agencies. The batteries were a type that was only available through restricted military supply channels, and the transmitters were configured to operate on frequencies that were monitored by the National Security Agency. Most concerning of all, Robert had learned that similar electronic components had been used in previous Soviet intelligence operations. The KGB was known to use sophisticated miniaturized equipment for covert communications, and the level of technical expertise required to modify the Happy Meal toys match the kind of work that Soviet intelligence operatives were trained to perform. By early November, Robert and Sandra had documented enough evidence to justify contacting federal authorities. They had photographs of 7 modified toys, detailed notes about the timing and location of each discovery, descriptions of suspicious individuals who had been present in the restaurant, and technical analysis of the electronic components that strongly suggested foreign intelligence involvement. Robert made the call to the FBI field office in Washington, D.C. on a Tuesday morning. He spoke with Special Agent Karen Mitchell, who initially seemed skeptical about a report involving modified Happy Meal toys. But when Robert began describing the technical specifications of the components and mentioned his own security clearance and background in defense contracting, Agent Mitchell's tone changed significantly. She scheduled a meeting for the following day and asked Robert to bring everything they had found, along with all of their documentation. The meeting took place at the FBI field office in a small conference room, with Agent Mitchell and 2 other agents, whose names Robert and Sandra were never told. The agents examined the modified toys with the same kind of intense focus that Robert had shown in his workshop, but with equipment that was far more sophisticated than anything he had access to. They photographed everything from multiple angles, took detailed measurements, and carefully removed the electronic components for separate analysis. Agent Mitchell explained that the FBI had been aware of increased Soviet intelligence activity in the Washington, D.C. area, but they had not identified the specific methods being used for communication between operatives and their handlers. The modified Happy Meal toys represented a breakthrough in understanding how the operation was functioning, but they also indicated that the scope of the network was much larger than anyone had suspected. The agents told Robert and Sandra that their cooperation would be essential for the investigation moving forward. Sandra would need to continue working at the McDonald's, but now she would be working as an informal informant for the FBI. She would be provided with specialized equipment for documenting anything suspicious, and she would have direct contact with Agent Mitchell for reporting any new discoveries. The work would be dangerous, the agents warned, because if the Soviet operatives realized that their communication network had been compromised, they might take drastic action to protect themselves and their operation. But Sandra agreed to help. At 19 years old, she understood that she had stumbled upon something much larger than herself, something that could impact national security and potentially save lives. The Cold War was not an abstract concept to her generation. They had grown up with the constant threat of nuclear war, with air raid drills in school, with the understanding that the United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in a global struggle that could determine the future of human civilization. The FBI moved quickly to expand their investigation. Within a week of the meeting with Robert and Sandra, they had placed surveillance teams at multiple McDonald's restaurants throughout Northern Virginia. They were looking for patterns similar to what Sandra had observed, trying to identify other locations where the modified toys were being used for covert communication. They also began monitoring the radio frequencies that the transmitters were configured to use, hoping to intercept actual communications between Soviet operatives. What the FBI discovered over the next several weeks was a communication network that was far more sophisticated and extensive than anyone had initially imagined. The modified Happy Meal toys were just one component of what appeared to be a multi-layered system that had been operating undetected for possibly years. Agent Mitchell briefed Sandra on what they had learned during their expanded surveillance operations. The McDonald's where Sandra worked was not an isolated location. FBI teams had identified at least 12 other fast food restaurants throughout the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area where similar activities were taking place. But it wasn't just McDonald's. Burger King, Wendy's, and even some local pizza places were being used as drop points for what the FBI was now calling Operation Happy Face. The pattern was remarkably consistent across all locations. Modified children's toys, always placed in food containers that had been carefully opened and resealed, always left behind during specific time windows, when the restaurants were busy enough to provide cover, but not so crowded that the activities would be easily observed. The Soviet operatives had clearly spent considerable time studying American fast food culture, understanding traffic patterns, peak hours, and the behavioral norms that would allow their activities to blend seamlessly into everyday life. But what made the operation particularly brilliant from an intelligence perspective was how it exploited the most innocent aspects of American society. Children's toys, family restaurants, the casual atmosphere of fast food dining. These were all elements that were so fundamentally non-threatening that they created perfect camouflage for sophisticated espionage activities. Who would suspect that a Happy Meal toy could be transmitting coded messages to Soviet handlers? The technical analysis of the components had revealed even more disturbing details. The transmitters were not just simple communication devices. They were programmable units that could store multiple coded messages, transmit on different frequencies at predetermined times, and even receive updated instructions remotely. The level of miniaturization and technical sophistication suggested that they had been manufactured specifically for this operation, possibly in specialized facilities within the Soviet Union or East Germany. Each toy contained a unique identifier code that would allow handlers to track which specific unit was being used for each communication. The toys could be programmed to activate only during certain time periods, making it extremely difficult for counterintelligence agencies to monitor their transmissions. And most concerning of all, the range of the transmitters was much greater than initially estimated. They could communicate with receivers located up to 15 miles away, which meant that Soviet handlers could monitor the network from locations well outside the immediate area of the drop sites. Sandra's role in the investigation had evolved significantly since that first meeting at the FBI field office. She was no longer just documenting suspicious activities. She had been trained in basic surveillance techniques, provided with specialized equipment for recording conversations and taking photographs without being detected, and given direct communication protocols for reporting urgent developments to Agent Mitchell. The FBI had also provided Sandra with detailed profiles of the individuals they suspected were involved in the operation. The man in his 40s, who Sandra had noticed during her initial observations, was identified as Viktor Petrov, a Soviet intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy. He had been under sporadic FBI surveillance for over 2 years, but agents had never been able to document specific illegal activities until Sandra's observations provided the missing link. The woman who came in with her young son was more problematic. The FBI suspected she was an American citizen who had been recruited by Soviet intelligence, possibly years earlier. Her name was Margaret Chen, and she worked as a secretary at the Department of Defense. Her security clearance gave her access to routine administrative documents, nothing classified at the highest levels, but potentially valuable for intelligence purposes. The fact that she was using her own child as cover for espionage activities made her case particularly disturbing to the federal agents involved in the investigation. But Viktor Petrov and Margaret Chen were apparently just two operatives in a much larger network. The FBI had identified at least 15 other individuals who appeared to be connected to Operation Happy Face. Some were Soviet nationals, operating under various forms of official cover. Others appeared to be American citizens who had been recruited as assets. The network included government employees, defense contractors, university researchers, and even some individuals whose connection to sensitive information was not immediately apparent. The scope of the operation raised serious questions about how long it had been running and what kind of information had already been compromised. The FBI began reviewing security incidents and document leaks going back several years, looking for patterns that might be connected to the Happy Meal communication network. What they found was deeply troubling. Several classified documents had appeared in Soviet intelligence reports over the past 3 years, documents that could only have been obtained from sources within the U.S. government or defense establishment. At the time, these leaks had been attributed to various suspected security breaches, but investigators had never been able to identify specific sources or methods. Now, with the discovery of the Happy Meal network, the FBI was able to trace at least some of these leaks to information that had been passed through the modified toy communication system. The investigation also revealed that the Soviet operatives had been remarkably patient and methodical in their approach. Rather than trying to obtain highly classified information quickly, they had focused on gathering large quantities of lower-level documents and data that individually seemed innocuous, but collectively provided a comprehensive picture of American defense capabilities, research projects, and strategic planning. Margaret Chen, for example, had been photographing routine administrative memos, personnel rosters, and meeting schedules from her office at the Department of Defense. None of these documents were classified, and individually, they would have been of little intelligence value. But when combined with similar information from other sources within the network, they provided Soviet analysts with detailed insights into the structure and operations of American defense agencies. Viktor Petrov had been coordinating the collection and transmission of this information through the Happy Meal network. The modified toys served as both storage devices and transmitters, allowing operatives like Margaret Chen to deposit coded information at predetermined locations without having to meet face-to-face with their handlers. The toys would be programmed with the collected intelligence and then left at specific restaurants, according to schedules that were probably coordinated through other communication channels. Soviet handlers would then retrieve the toys, extract the stored information, and replace them with new units containing updated instructions or requests for specific types of intelligence. The entire cycle could be completed without any direct contact between operatives and handlers, making it extremely difficult for counterintelligence agencies to detect or disrupt the network. The FBI's surveillance teams had documented dozens of these exchanges over the course of their investigation. They had identified the specific tables and locations within restaurants where the modified toys were typically placed. They had tracked the timing patterns that operatives used for their visits. They had even managed to photograph several exchanges in progress, though they had been careful not to intervene until they had gathered enough evidence to dismantle the entire network. But the investigation had also revealed how close the operation had come to remaining undetected indefinitely. Sandra's discovery of the first modified toys had been essentially accidental. If she had not been curious about the unusual weight of that Happy Meal box, if her father had not had the technical expertise to recognize the significance of the electronic components, if they had decided to simply ignore what they had found rather than reporting it to authorities, Operation Happy Face might have continued operating for years. The implications were staggering when agents considered what might have been accomplished by similar networks that had not been discovered. How many other Soviet intelligence operations were using equally creative methods to blend into American society? How much classified information had been compromised through networks that remained undetected? How many American citizens had been recruited as assets without the knowledge of counterintelligence agencies? These questions became even more urgent when the FBI's technical analysis revealed that the modified Happy Meal toys contained components that had been manufactured relatively recently. The operation was not a legacy system that had been running since the early days of the Cold War. It appeared to have been implemented within the past 2 or 3 years, which suggested that Soviet intelligence agencies were actively developing new and more sophisticated methods for conducting espionage operations on American soil. The timing also coincided with a period of increased tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. President Reagan had been taking an increasingly aggressive stance toward Soviet activities around the world, and there had been several high-profile incidents involving suspected Soviet spies operating within the United States. The discovery of Operation Happy Face provided concrete evidence that these concerns were justified and that Soviet intelligence agencies were indeed escalating their activities in response to American pressure. Agent Mitchell had warned Sandra that the investigation was entering a critical phase where the risks would increase significantly. The FBI was preparing to begin making arrests, but they needed to coordinate their actions carefully to avoid alerting operatives who might not yet be under direct surveillance. If word of the investigation leaked prematurely, Soviet handlers might be able to warn their assets and help them escape prosecution or flee the country. Sandra's continued observations at the McDonald's had become even more important as the FBI prepared for the final phase of their operation. She was now documenting not just the placement and retrieval of modified toys, but also the specific individuals who were present during these activities. Her photographs and notes would be crucial evidence in the prosecution of the operatives who had been identified as part of the network. But the pressure of working as an informal FBI informant, while maintaining her normal routine as a college student and part-time McDonald's employee, was beginning to take its toll on Sandra. She was constantly alert for suspicious activities, always watching for faces she recognized from FBI briefings, always careful to document everything she observed without appearing to be doing anything unusual. The stress of knowing that she was involved in a major counterintelligence operation was exhausting, and she had begun having trouble sleeping and concentrating on her studies. The investigation was about to reach its climax, and Sandra Williams, a 19-year-old community college student, who had simply been doing her job cleaning tables at a McDonald's, was about to play a crucial role in dismantling one of the most sophisticated Soviet espionage networks ever discovered operating within the United States. The United States. The final phase of the investigation began on a cold Monday morning in December 1987. Agent Mitchell arrived at the FBI field office at 5:30 a.m. to coordinate what would become known as Operation Cleanup, the simultaneous arrest of 15 suspected Soviet operatives and their American assets across the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. The timing had been carefully calculated. Intelligence analysts had determined that Monday mornings represented the lowest risk period for the network, when operatives would be least likely to be actively communicating or meeting with their handlers. Sandra received her final briefing the previous evening at a location that had become familiar to her over the past 2 months, a small office building in Arlington where the FBI had established a temporary command center for the investigation. Agent Mitchell explained that Sandra's role would be crucial during the arrest phase, but it would also be the most dangerous period of her involvement with the case. If any of the operatives suspected that their network had been compromised, they might take desperate action to destroy evidence or eliminate witnesses. The plan was methodical and comprehensive. FBI teams had been positioned at each of the 12 restaurants where modified toys had been discovered. Additional teams were stationed at the homes and workplaces of the identified operatives. Surveillance units were monitoring the Soviet embassy and other diplomatic facilities where intelligence officers might attempt to seek refuge. The entire operation would begin simultaneously at exactly 7 a.m., when most of the targets would be at predictable locations. Sandra was instructed to arrive at the McDonald's for her regular shift, but federal agents would be positioned throughout the restaurant posing as customers. If Viktor Petrov or any of the other known operatives appeared, Sandra was to signal the agents by placing a specific item on the counter in a predetermined location. Under no circumstances was she to attempt to interact with or detain anyone herself. Her safety was the FBI's primary concern, and they had made it clear that preserving evidence was secondary to protecting her from potential retaliation. At exactly 7 a.m., FBI teams moved simultaneously across Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. The coordination required split-second timing, because any delay at one location could alert operatives at other sites and give them time to destroy evidence or flee. Radio communications between teams were constant, as agents reported successful entries, arrests, and the seizure of evidence from multiple locations. Viktor Petrov was arrested at his apartment in Georgetown as he was preparing to leave for what appeared to be a routine morning meeting at the Soviet embassy. Agents found his apartment filled with sophisticated radio equipment, coding materials, and detailed maps of the Washington area, with restaurants marked in what appeared to be a systematic pattern. Hidden in a false bottom of his bedroom dresser were more than 50 modified electronic components, identical to those found in the Happy Meal toys, along with programming equipment that could be used to configure the transmitters for specific frequencies and operational parameters. Margaret Chen was taken into custody at her home in Alexandria, just as she was getting her son ready for school. The arrest was particularly difficult for the agents involved because of the presence of the child, who was clearly unaware of his mother's involvement in espionage activities. Social services personnel were called to the scene to ensure the boy's welfare while his mother was processed. A search of the Chen residence revealed a sophisticated photography setup in the basement, including specialized cameras and lighting equipment designed for copying documents, along with hundreds of photographs of Defense Department materials dating back nearly 3 years. But the most significant discovery came from the arrest of an operative whose involvement had not been suspected until the final days of the investigation. Dr. James Harrison was a research physicist at a government laboratory in Maryland who had been passing information about advanced radar systems and missile defense technologies to Soviet handlers through the Happy Meal network. His arrest yielded evidence of intelligence compromises that were far more serious than anything the FBI had initially suspected. Sandra Williams had no idea that staying late to wipe down tables would lead to uncovering one of the most sophisticated espionage operations in Cold War history. Her curiosity about a suspiciously heavy Happy Meal box exposed a network that had been operating undetected for years, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries happen in the most ordinary moments. The next time you see someone being unusually observant about the small details around them, remember Sandra's story and how paying attention to what others might ignore can change everything.